I remember the silence of that night more than anything. The base was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the world had forgotten me. A single light flickered above the ammunition depot, buzzing faintly in the darkness. My boots struck the concrete in steady rhythm, the sound echoing in the empty air. To anyone passing by, I was nothing more than a staff sergeant pulling a lonely guard shift, a face without a name, a soldier without a story. But the truth is never so simple. Once I had carried a different rank, a different weight on my shoulders. I had stood in places where every choice could mean life or death, and I had lost people I loved in deserts far from home. I buried that past, or maybe I let it bury me, because the army has a way of punishing those who refuse to stay silent. They thought they could strip me of a title and erase who I was. What they never understood is that the past does not disappear. It waits. Some of you may be wondering who I really am. How does a captain become a nameless guard? What secrets could force a soldier into the shadows? That is the story I am about to tell you. If you believe these hidden stories deserve to be heard, if you honor the quiet strength of those who still stand watch long after the spotlight has moved on, subscribe to Military Revenge. Share this journey so the sacrifices of ordinary soldiers, men and women alike, are not forgotten. That night, as the gates opened and a Delta officer stepped into the glow of that flickering light, I knew my life was about to change forever. The graveyard shift has its own weather, air that tastes like old metal, lights that hum instead of shine. At Fort Bragg, the depot sits at the edge of things where the road's thin and the breeze carries hints of pine and diesel. I walked my loop in a steady cadence and listened to the base breathe in its sleep. Radios murmured. A forklift coughed somewhere far off, then went quiet again. Routine is a blanket if you let it be. You tuck it under your chin and you try not to dream. Turner liked to catch me between checkpoints. He had a talent for timing and a voice that clipped the air. He would stand with hands on hips and inspect nothing. Then he would inspect me. Staff Sergeant Morales, you make this too comfortable. Pick up the pace. Watch those West cameras. You want a chair, then go retire. I learned not to answer. He fed on pushback. I kept my posture square and let the silence hold. A long time ago, a master sergeant taught me the power of still water, smooth on the surface, deep as it needs to be. Most nights were predictable. Sign the ledger, walk the perimeter, check the locks by touch even after checking them on the monitor because hands do not lie. A faded placard near Bay C rattled inside its screws when the wind hit right. That sound could make you think someone whispered your name. Then you remembered it was only aluminum and weather and you moved on. I marked times in my head the way runners count breaths. That was how I kept the hard thoughts from flooding in. There are places you never mention out loud because the syllables carry dust and blood. Kandahar lives at the back of my throat. Mosul rides my left shoulder when the night gets too quiet. Faces flash and fade like the reflection of a convoy in a broken window. You keep them with you because that is what love looks like when you are a soldier, and most of your family is scattered across continents and headstones. If you understand that kind of love, you will understand me. And if stories like this mean something to you, hit the subscribe button for Military Revenge so you can walk this road with me to the end. Turner did not believe in invisible labor. He believed in optics. He believed in shiny boots and perfect cover sheets and the theater of command. He would hover beside my desk in the guard shack and adjust the angle of a stapler with 2 fingers like he was tuning a rifle. Then he would tell me my log entries were too terse. Then he would tell me they were too long. A man can drown you with an eyedropper if he is patient enough. I refused to get wet. Every shift has a point where the mind wants to drift. That is when mistakes are born. I fought it with small rituals. I brewed coffee strong enough to stand a spoon and poured it into a dented thermos that had followed me through 3 duty stations. I tightened the laces on my boots at the 40-minute mark like a runner tightening a pace. I ran my fingertips along the bolt heads of gate 2 the way a blind reader touches the edge of a page. Muscle memory is its own kind of prayer. The supply trucks rolled in and out with the slow persistence of tides. Drivers waved 2 fingers from the wheel. Some played old country through cracked windows. A few learned my name and used it like a question. You good Morales? I would nod. My voice lived behind my teeth unless it had to come out. Quiet does not mean weak. Quiet means you choose where your strength goes. Mine went into small acts of order that keep people alive without ever knowing who touched the dial. One night, a private first class named Avery came by with clipboards and a grin. He had that fresh brightness new soldiers carry like a light bulb. He told me he had a baby girl in Fayetteville and showed me a photo on his phone of a tiny fist wrapped around a bigger finger. He said he was saving for a used truck and for a house he had not seen yet except on Zillow. I told him to buy good tires before anything else, and he laughed like I had told a joke. That laugh stuck with me as he walked away, and I watched him until he turned the corner. In another life, I had given the same advice to someone I loved, and he had ignored it and paid for it on a wet road outside a wire. Some lessons cost too much. By midnight, the fog came low and thick across the tarmac. The fence line gleamed with moisture. I pulled my collar higher and felt the night press against my cheek. A helicopter thumped beyond the tree line, then faded. The bass has a way of sounding like a heartbeat when you stop to listen. That night it sounded steady and calm. I took comfort in that. Soldiers sleep better when the silence is clean. Turner returned near one. He carried a clipboard because he always needed something to hold. He asked for inventory numbers we had already filed and then asked me to refax them to an office that did not need them. He stood too close when he spoke. He wanted the smell of his power in your lungs. I stepped back the width of my boot and pretended it was to reach the machine. He noticed. He stepped closer. The old dance. I smiled inside without letting any of it touch my face. A ranger learns the shape of pressure and how to let it slide past. He glanced at my chest and found the absence he loved. No shiny ribbons, no combat patch, only my name tape and the soft wear of a uniform that had seen more laundry than ceremony. He nodded as if the fabric confirmed his theory of me. Then he left with his clipboard and a parting reminder to clean the lint trap of the fax machine because readiness begins with details. He said it like a proverb. Some officers collect sayings because truth would require reflection. After he left, I sat for a minute and let the quiet settle. I thought of a street in Kandahar where the market opens at first light and the bread smells like warmth itself. I remembered standing there with a small boy tugging at my sleeve because he wanted to show me his new shoes. They were too big and he looked proud anyway. 10 minutes later, the world went white and brown, and then it was smoke and sirens, and we ran into the wreckage because that is what we do. I still see his shoes sometimes when the depot is too still. People ask what ghosts look like. I tell them they look like everything you were supposed to protect. The first sign that the week would not be like other weeks was a simple email. A notice of inspection, external audit, nothing special in the words. The timing felt wrong. The routes for incoming loads shifted twice in one day. A crate that should have had one seal had two, and the numbers did not match the manifest. Little things, the kind of off notes you hear only if you have played the song for years. I logged it. I mentioned it to the sergeant on the next shift because truth likes daylight. He shrugged and said the quartermaster had been off his game. Maybe so. My gut did not agree. You learn to carry your own counsel when your reputation lives in a drawer somewhere with a stamp across it. The drawer stays closed and people fill in the blanks they cannot open. That is fine. I did not need their certainty. I needed the perimeter to hold and the paperwork to match the pallets and the young ones to go home to their babies with 10 fingers and 10 toes. You learn to set your bar where it belongs. Then you measure yourself against it in the dark and you do not share the results. Toward the end of shift, a rumor drifted through the grapevine. Delta coming in for a walk through. No one knew why. The air changed as rumors always change it. You could feel a tension gather like static. I felt something else, a hollow and a heat at the same time. Memory is a river that rises without warning. I went outside and breathed until my hands steadied. Then I walked the line again with a polish that would pass any inspection. If you want to hear how that inspection turned the night on its head, keep listening and consider tapping subscribe so this story finds its way back to you. Morning made the concrete look honest again. Sunlight does that for everything except lies. I turned over my post and signed my name and left with a fresh list of supplies to order. Coffee filters, battery packs, printer toner. The kind of items that hold a world together while everyone calls them boring. I checked my phone later and saw a message from a number I recognized by muscle alone. An old teammate had sent 2 words, heard things. I stared until the screen timed out, then I put it away. By dusk, the base wore a new kind of alertness. Trucks moved with better spacing. Radios sounded a half-click sharper. A pair of MPs slowed by gate 2 and gave me the glance that says my chief told me to take a look without making it a thing. I nodded and let them take a slow loop with me, then thanked them like it had been my request. People relax when they think they are following your lead. That skill has saved more lives than marksmanship. Turner arrived with a clipboard and a shine on his boots that reflected the window bars. He relayed the plan with the flat emphasis of a checklist. Delta Force will conduct a limited inspection of storage protocols and chain of custody. Provide immediate access. Do not deviate from prescribed script. He wanted the words to bite. They did not. He scanned my uniform again the way a man checks for a blemish on a rental car. Keeping appearances spotless was his sacrament. He could not bless what he could not see, and my past was invisible by design. Night fell like folded cloth. The depot lights drew circles on wet concrete. I ran a full sequence on doors and panels and redundant locks because redundancy is only boring until it saves you. The radio on my shoulder crackled with 2 short bursts. That pattern meant incoming convoy at the outer gate. I straightened without meaning to and set my feet the way I always do when something old wakes up inside my chest. Breathing deeper helps, so does making yourself small. Pride gets you killed, precision does not. Engines low and disciplined, headlights cutting quiet spears across the approach. Black vehicles that wore their anonymity like armor. I stepped out and took position by the checkpoint with the clipboard Turner loved and the calm he lacked. The first door opened. A lieutenant colonel stepped into the light. He did not look around to be seen. He looked to understand. That is how you can tell reality from the theater. He met my eyes and something flickered that was not surprising so much as recognition, the kind you feel when a song from another life drifts through a doorway. He introduced himself with nothing extra. I returned the same. I checked authorization with a thoroughness that did not tremble. Forms matched. Time windows lined up. Signatures were what they were supposed to be. He handed back the tablet, and his hand paused a fraction too long. Captain Morales, his eyes said, though his mouth did not. I held the gaze, then I let it go. The gate mechanism clanked with a familiar finality, and the convoy slid through like it had done this forever. Turner hurried up late and loud. His voice bounced against the chain link. He asked the lieutenant colonel if he had been notified of this timeline. He requested to review authorization despite the fact that I had already done so. The officer thanked him for his diligence and said the paperwork had been verified at the appropriate level. Appropriate is a word that can slice both ways. Turner heard only the side that made him taller. The officer gave me a small nod meant only for me. It said you did this right. It said I remember. I watched the team move through the bays with the choreography of people who have worked together long enough to skip words. One scanned overhead. One held a tablet and pointed without pointing. One watched the watchers and never let his hands forget his weapon. They checked seals with numbered discipline and photographed each pallet the same way every time, so the pattern itself became proof. This is what competence looks like. It is quiet. It is boring to people who think drama equals danger. It is how families get to keep their dinners warm. Between passes, I let my mind drift a single inch. I saw an alley in Mosul where a wall had been spray painted with a heart and a name. The paint had run in sun and dust until the heart looked like it was melting down the bricks. A boy had laughed and called it a candle. The next day that wall was gone. I thought of candles now as I watched the lights shake a little in the wind and felt thankful for every bulb that held. Turner wanted to speak to the lieutenant colonel again, and this time he tried to box me out of the conversation with his body. I took a half step sideways that made space for both of us without asking permission. The officer noticed and stepped closer to me rather than to Turner. Small shifts tell true stories. Turner flushed. He started to ask who had verified the chain of custody earlier. The officer answered that his staff sergeant had done so. He meant me. Turner began to say that seemed an odd delegation. The officer let the sentence die on the concrete. Silence can be a wall if you build it right. The inspection wrapped cleaner than most. The team signed out with a short list of recommendations that matched the ones I had filed last quarter. The officer handed me a copy. He held my eyes just long enough to say what he could not say in front of Turner. Good work, good judgment. Keep the line tight. He left it at that, and the convoy disappeared into the night like competent ghosts, the kind you do not fear. After they left the base, settled into the kind of buzz that follows any brush with people who actually do the work. Turner paced. He told me to write a supplemental log with exact times and verbatim phrases. I wrote what needed writing and nothing more. I used the same clean handwriting I used on casualty lists years ago because clarity is a kind of mercy. When the shack went quiet again, I poured the last of the coffee and let my eyes close. I thought about the rank that used to sit on my collar. I thought about the weight of it and how it could lift and crush at once. I thought about the day I put it down for someone else's comfort. Some truths cost you wages and titles and the easy kind of friendship. Some truths buy you a life you can live with. If you think that difference matters, keep this story close and share it with someone who needs to hear a steady voice. Near dawn, a mist came in like breath on glass. I took one last walk and touched every gate. Bay C rattled its little rattle, and I answered it with a finger on the screw. I signed over the post as the sky grayed. The young sergeant from day shift arrived with sleep still on his face. He asked how it went. I said smooth. He said he heard Delta had come by. I said they had and left the rest on the table where it belonged. On my way back to the barracks, I passed the chapel. A janitor was propping the door and humming a tune I half recognized. Faith on a base is a practical thing. You show up, you sweep floors, you light a candle with your palms cupped to hide the flame from the wind. I stood outside and watched the door for a minute, then kept walking. My faith lives elsewhere now. In the way good teams moved. On the way a young private carried a photo like a medal. In the way a lieutenant colonel said nothing and gave everything away with his eyes. My phone buzzed again. Same number. Heard things he had written the day before. A second message now. Proud of you. I did not answer. I let the words sit. Pride is a warm coat, and some nights you cannot wear it because the world needs you sharper. There would be time later. There is not always time. That is one of the first lessons and one of the last. Back in my room, I set the thermos in the sink and watched the last ribbon of coffee slide away. I took off my boots and placed them side by side the way we were taught as privates, because order is a kindness you can give yourself even when no one watches. I lay down and stared at the ceiling and thought about the gate, the lights, the clipboard, the careful hands that had checked what needed checking. I thought about Turner and how some men mistake noise for authority. I thought about Walker and how some leaders hold rooms quietly. Names change, truth does not. Sleep came hard and short. When I woke up, the sun was a clean sheet across the floor. I dressed. I was laced. I headed back toward the depot because it was my turn and because I wanted to be there. Some posts you stand because you must. Some you stand because you choose to be where the seam meets the fabric. This one was both, and somewhere down the road a line had been crossed. I could feel it under my boots. The night before had been a beginning pretending to be a routine. If you are ready for what comes next, hit like and subscribe so you do not miss the moment the mask slips and the real story steps into the light. The morning after Delta's arrival, Fort Bragg did not look different, but it felt different. Soldiers hurried a little faster across the motor pool, as if a rumor had put steel in their boots. Even the air had that weight before a storm, the kind you can feel pressing against your chest. I had been in enough war zones to know when something invisible was already moving the pieces on the board. Turner was already waiting by the depot when I arrived for my shift, clipboard in hand. Jaw set tight, his entire body language announced authority he had not earned. He barked orders about staging pallets, though none of it required his presence. Then he fixed me with that sharp, shallow smile of his. Staff Sergeant Morales, today you get the honor of greeting our visitors. Stand tall, make us look sharp. To him, I was not a soldier, but a prop, something he could place at the gate to decorate the base. I held my tongue. I had learned long ago that silence can carry more strength than argument. The day stretched long, trucks idled, paperwork changed hands, and my boots wore down the concrete at the perimeter. Turner strutted through the bays, correcting posture, snapping at privates about dust on crates that had sat through 2 hurricanes. He was building a stage for an audience he wanted to impress. I knew men like him, theatrical commanders. They shine in front of a camera. But under real fire, they wilt. You can always tell by how they treat the invisible work that keeps a place like this alive. To him, my role was invisible until it was useful. By dusk, headlights cut across the main gate and a convoy rolled in with the quiet discipline only elite units carry. The air changed again. Radios snapped to life, clipped voices confirming codes. Soldiers straightened as if a gust of respect had swept through the yard. And then they stepped out, Delta Force, in plain fatigues, but with an energy that filled the space. These were not men who needed to raise their voices. Their very presence set the tempo. At their head walked a lieutenant colonel, broad-shouldered, steady eyes, movements precise but unhurried. He carried authority like it was an extension of his body. I froze for a fraction of a second when I saw him. Recognition is not always instant. Sometimes it blooms like an old scar warming in the cold. Walker, James Walker. I had not spoken his name aloud in years, but my bones remembered him before my mind did. He scanned the checkpoint, then his gaze found me. For a heartbeat, the depot disappeared. Kandahar came rushing back, hot sand in the wind, the echo of mortar fire in the distance, the way he had once stood beside me as we pulled two wounded out of a burning convoy. His eyes widened just slightly and then narrowed with something between disbelief and relief. Captain Morales, he almost said, though his lips did not move. Instead, his eyebrows lifted, and I read the words there. I thought you were gone. I stiffened, my throat locked. The rank he remembered had been stripped from me. To acknowledge it now would have been to break the wall I had built, so I gave him nothing but formality. Authorization papers are cleared, sir. Signatures match. I am here to ensure the process is smooth. The words tasted like ash, but they were all I could offer. Turner rushed up just in time to see the recognition flash between us. His expression flickered from confusion to suspicion, then quickly rearranged into his usual mask of confidence. He stepped forward, hand outstretched, his voice booming louder than necessary. Major Turner, Logistics Command, welcome to Bragg. We are honored by your presence. He positioned himself half a step in front of me as if shielding me from notice. But Walker's gaze lingered on me, steady, unshaken. He saw through the curtain Turner tried to pull. The inspection began. Delta moved with quiet efficiency, checking seals, photographing manifests, questioning protocols in tones that carried no doubt of authority. Turner followed them like a shadow, offering explanations nobody had asked for. I stayed at my post, clipboard in hand, watching, listening, forcing my breathing to remain even. Yet every time Walker's eyes brushed past me, the memories returned. Nights under foreign stars, conversations whispered over radios. The moment he had pulled me back when shrapnel split the wall near Mosul. He remembered. I knew it in the way he looked at me, as if searching for the woman I had once been. At one point, he drifted closer under the guise of checking the security log. His voice was low, meant for me alone, Morales. His tone carried both certainty and question. I kept my eyes on the paper. You must be mistaken, sir. I am just a staff sergeant assigned to guard detail. The words landed heavy in my chest, like denying my own reflection. But I had made a promise to myself years ago. Never again would I let my past drag someone else into the fire. Walker's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. Turner saw the exchange. His eyes narrowed, calculating. He did not yet know what to make of it, but suspicion had been planted. That I knew would cost me later. Men like Turner do not tolerate shadows they cannot control. The night dragged on, Delta combing through every bay with precision. Turner preened at their questions, trying to answer before I could, but the lieutenant colonel directed several confirmations to me instead. Every time I responded, Walker's eyes held mine a second too long. Respect, regret, and something I did not dare name. By the end of the inspection, Turner's smile had begun to crack. He knew something had shifted, though he could not define it. When the convoy pulled away, silence settled heavy over the depot. Turner turned to me. Voice sharp as broken glass. Interesting that the lieutenant colonel seemed to think you worth his time. Care to explain, Sergeant? I met his gaze without blinking. Sir, I only did my duty. His lips curled. We will see about that. I walked the perimeter one last time before dawn, the night air sharp in my lungs. Walker's eyes haunted me more than Turner's threats. Recognition carries both comfort and danger. For years I had been content to fade into obscurity, to live with the weight of silence. But now the past had found me again, and it wore the face of a man who remembered too much. If you have ever buried your own truth so deep you thought no one would ever dig it up, then you know the fear and the relief that come when someone finally does. That is where my story truly begins, and if you want to hear the rest of it, stay close. These next moments changed everything. Sleep came in fragments that night, restless and shallow. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Walker's face, lit by the harsh depot lights, his expression caught between memory and disbelief. And behind that image came another, the look on Turner's face when he realized he no longer controlled the narrative. That look worried me more than mortar fire ever had. Men like Turner didn't forget, and they didn't forgive. At dawn, I walked across the base to the mess hall. The line of soldiers shuffled forward, trays clattering, voices low with morning fatigue. It was the same routine I had followed for months, yet my skin prickled with unease. Routine no longer felt safe. The past had been stirred, and once that happened, nothing stayed quiet. As I ate, voices buzzed around me. Delta's inspection had left ripples across the unit. Some soldiers speculated about new missions, others whispered about Turner's eagerness to impress. A private leaned across to another and muttered something about seeing the lieutenant colonel watching me at the gate. I kept my head down, but I could feel the shift in the air. Rumors were dangerous currency in the military. By midday, I was back on duty. Turner appeared again, sharp and restless. He stalked through the depot as though searching for something invisible. His eyes kept darting toward me, full of questions he hadn't yet dared to ask aloud. Finally, he stopped in front of me. "You've been in long enough to know how things work, morals," he said. His tone was casual, but his eyes were hard. "Connections are everything. You might think standing still will keep you safe, but people notice. And when they notice the wrong things, careers fall apart." I gave him nothing but a steady nod. "Yes, sir." His lips twisted into a smile that held no warmth. "Good, remember that." Then he walked away. I had heard threats dressed as advice before. Years ago, in a different uniform, a colonel had pulled me aside after a briefing in Kandahar. He had leaned close, his voice heavy with warning. "Let this go, Captain Morales. Don't stir things that don't concern you." Only it had concerned me. It concerned every soldier under my command. Back then, I had been young enough to believe truth was stronger than politics. We had discovered discrepancies in supply shipments. Weapons missing, fuel unaccounted for, manifests forged. At first, I thought it was a clerical error. Then I saw the pattern. Someone was siphoning resources, selling them off, leaving soldiers exposed in the field. I reported it. I thought justice would follow. Instead, I became the problem. The colonel I accused had connections far above my pay grade. Investigations stalled, evidence disappeared, and suddenly questions turned on me. I was told I had overstepped, that I had misunderstood. Then came the demotion, stripped of my captain's bars. I was reassigned, my reputation whispered into shadows. I watched friends pull away, not out of betrayal but survival. No one wanted to stand too close to someone marked. That was how I became the invisible soldier Turner saw today, not because I lacked merit, but because I had once refused to stay silent. And silence in the military often matters more than courage. That evening, as I locked up the depot, I found Walker waiting near the motor pool. He stood casually, hands in his pockets. But his eyes never missed a thing. He waited until I came close, then spoke quietly. "You told me once you'd never back down from the truth. Did that change?" The words cut deeper than I wanted them to. I looked at him, the same man who had once carried a wounded corporal on his shoulders through enemy fire. He had always been steady, the kind of leader soldiers trusted without question. Now he was looking at me as though I had abandoned everything I once stood for. "I didn't change," I said finally. "The system did, and when it did, I paid the price." Walker's jaw clenched. "They said you left. Rumors traveled even in the desert. Some said you cracked, others that you walked away. I never believed it." I shook my head. "I didn't walk away. I was pushed out, demoted. They buried me in logistics where no one would ask questions." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he spoke, low and certain. "You saved my squad once. If you hadn't pulled us back from that ridge, none of us would be standing here. That's the woman I remember, and that's the woman I saw yesterday, no matter what stripes they took from your uniform." His words hit harder than any reprimand ever had. Respect carries weight, especially when it comes from someone who has bled beside you, yet with that weight came danger. If Walker still believed in me, others might too, and Turner would not allow that, as if summoned. Turner appeared at the far end of the yard. His gaze flicked between us, his expression sharp with suspicion. He didn't interrupt, but the set of his shoulders told me everything. He would not forget this conversation. Walker noticed too. His voice dropped even lower. "Watch yourself around him. Men like Turner build their power on shadows. They can't afford light." I forced a small smile, though inside I felt the tension coil tighter. "I've learned to survive in the shadows." He held my gaze a moment longer, then nodded. "If you ever decide shadows aren't enough, you know where to find me." The convoy left the next morning, their trucks rumbling out of the gate before dawn. Soldiers watched with a mix of awe and envy. Delta carried a mystique that lingered long after their departure. Turner strutted across the yard, pretending their praise reflected on him. Yet I noticed his eyes still found me, measuring, calculating. Over the next week, Turner's scrutiny intensified. He assigned me extra shifts, always with the excuse of discipline or readiness. He questioned me in front of others, probing for cracks. His words were sharp, but his eyes carried deeper questions. He wanted to know what Walker had seen in me, what link tied us together. I kept my silence. Outwardly, I remained the obedient staff sergeant. Inside, I felt the ground shifting beneath me. The past was stirring, and with it came both risk and possibility. One night, as I walked the perimeter under a heavy moon, I thought of the soldiers buried in foreign soil. Friends who never came home, men and women who had trusted me to lead. Their faces rose in the silence, reminding me that honor is not a rank pinned to a collar, but the choices you make when no one is watching. Turner thought he had me caged. Walker thought he had found me again. The truth was, I was still deciding who I would be, and though the depot remained quiet, I knew this was only the beginning. Secrets have a way of surfacing, and once they do, they can change everything. If you want to understand how far a soldier can be pushed before she chooses to fight back, you'll want to keep listening. The choices I made next would set fire to the careful shadows I had built, and there would be no turning back. In the days that followed Delta's departure, the depot settled back into its uneasy rhythm. Trucks arrived with their usual paperwork, soldiers logged their hours, and Turner prowled like a restless hawk. To anyone on the outside, it looked like business as usual. But once the past stirs, you cannot unearth it halfway. Shadows that once seemed safe begin to thin, and secrets press closer to the surface. I had kept my silence for so long I almost believed it myself. Yet Walker's presence had cracked something open. Every look he had given me was a reminder of the soldier I once was, the soldier I had buried. One night after roll call, I sat alone in the barracks with a folder spread across my lap. The pages were filled with logistics forms, shipment receipts, and routing orders. I had been tasked with reconciling the records, a mindless chore Turner thought would remind me of my place. But as my eyes scanned the lines, I felt the old instinct sharpen, numbers out of sequence, dates mismatched, a seal where no seal should have been. It wasn't just sloppy paperwork, it was deliberate. The realization hit me with a familiar chill. This was how it had begun before, the first time I had spoken up. I had seen the same patterns in Kandahar when crates of fuel were logged twice, when rifles appeared on manifests that never reached our soldiers. Back then, I thought I could fix it. I believed truth had power. Instead, I had been punished, my career ground down into silence. Now the same fingerprints had returned, different bases, different faces, but the same rot, and Turner's signature sat at the bottom of the page. My hands clenched around the folder. Every instinct screamed to burn it, to walk away before the pattern repeated. Yet I knew walking away had never saved anyone. Soldiers would pay the price just as they always had. That night, I dreamed of Mosul, the smell of smoke and metal. The sound of young voices cut short. I woke with sweat on my skin, and the folder was still clutched in my hand. The past did not whisper anymore, it was demanding. The next day, Walker appeared at the edge of the motor pool. He wasn't supposed to be there. Delta had already rotated back out. But he walked toward me with the calm certainty of a man who still had business unfinished. We stood in the shadow of the depot, where Turner's eyes couldn't easily follow. He studied me quietly before he spoke. I know that look, Morales. I've seen it before. It's the face you wore the night you refused to leave 2 men behind on the ridge. I stiffened, my pulse unsteady. You shouldn't be here. His eyes didn't waver. Maybe not, but I had to see you again. What you said last time about being pushed out, that never sat right with me. And now I hear whispers. Your name in conversations Turner thinks are private. Something isn't clean here. I should have lied. I should have told him to walk away. But the words caught in my throat instead. I handed him the folder. He flipped through it quickly, his brows pulling tight. Forged seals, duplicate manifests, weapons logged twice, same pattern. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the same recognition that had haunted me all week. You were right before, weren't you, Kandahar? You saw this then too. I swallowed hard, and it cost me everything. Walker shook his head. No, they took a title, not everything. You are still the soldier who saved us. We need people like you. The men still talk about you, Morales. They remember. His words struck deep, carving through the layers of silence I had wrapped around myself. For a moment, I felt the weight lift, the memory of who I had once been flickering alive again, but with it came fear. I can't go through that again, I whispered. I can't watch the truth get buried and find myself buried with it. He stepped closer, his voice steady. You won't be alone this time. Something in the way he said it made my chest tighten. It wasn't just a promise of solidarity. It was personal, carved out of shared history and a bond neither of us had spoken aloud. For years, I had forced myself not to feel it. Now it pressed at the surface with quiet strength. Before I could answer, Turner's voice echoed across the yard. Morales. His stride was brisk, his eyes sharp. Walker stepped back, his face unreadable as Turner closed the distance. Colonel Walker. Turner said, a note of forced cheer in his voice. I wasn't aware Delta was still poking around. Walker handed the folder back to me with deliberate calm, just checking a few procedures, Major. No cause for concern. His tone was polite, but the undercurrent was steel. Turner's gaze shifted to me, cold and probing. Procedures are my business, Sergeant. I trust you'll keep them in order. Yes, sir, I answered, my voice even. He lingered a moment longer, his suspicion palpable, before turning on his heel and walking away. His shadow stretched long across the depot floor like a warning left behind. When he was gone, Walker's voice dropped low. He's watching you, and if he knows what you've found, he won't stop until you're silent again. I clutched the folder tighter. Then what choice do I have? Walker met my gaze. The same choice you always had, to fight. I looked away, my chest heavy. Fighting had already cost me once, but as I glanced at the paperwork, at the forged lines and false seals, I knew silence would cost far more. Soldiers would die because men like Turner treated war as business. That night I sat alone in the barracks, the memory of Walker's voice echoing in my head. The bond between us had always been forged in fire, in moments when trust meant survival. And now, years later, he still carried that trust as though it had never faded. But Turner carried suspicion, and suspicion in the wrong hands was lethal. The depot hummed with silence, but inside me, war drums had begun again. If you've ever tried to bury your own truth, you know it never stays buried. It waits, patient and sharp, for the moment you least expect. That moment was coming for me, and it would demand a choice I was no longer sure I had the strength to make. The next week bled into long nights and restless mornings. On the surface, nothing had changed. Trucks rumbled in and out, soldiers performed their duties, and Turner carried on with his clipped voice and self-importance. But beneath that thin layer of normalcy, the current was shifting. Every document I touched, every shipment I logged seemed to hum with unease. I began cross-checking files in secret, long after lights out. A flashlight balanced on my bunk. Papers spread across the narrow mattress. I followed the trails of numbers and seals like breadcrumbs. The deeper I went, the clearer the pattern became. Crates listed as delivered were missing. Ammunition routed to one sector was logged again under another. It was more than sloppy paperwork. It was a system, deliberate and careful, designed to siphon supplies without drawing attention. And all of it pointed back to Turner. I copied nothing, left no trail. Memory became my weapon. Every forged date etched into my mind. Still, I knew the risk. If Turner caught me digging, it wouldn't just be my career on the line this time. Men like him did not bluff, they eliminated threats. Walker returned quietly 2 nights later. I found him waiting near the far fence, away from prying eyes. His presence alone carried danger, but I felt a surge of steadiness the moment I saw him. He studied my face, then spoke. You found more, didn't you? I nodded. Keeping my voice low, it's a pipeline. He's moving weapons, ammunition, maybe more. The paperwork is all forged, but it's too clean. Someone else is helping him, someone above his pay grade. Walker's jaw tightened. Do you realize what this means? I did. It meant betrayal on a scale larger than one arrogant major. It meant someone inside the system was feeding a network that thrived on stolen blood and steel. I whispered it anyway. This isn't just Turner. He nodded slowly. I've heard whispers too, contractors. Private firms buy influence where they can. If Turner is their man on the inside, this runs deeper than you think. The words hit me like a blade of cold steel. Private military contractors. I had crossed their shadows once before, years ago. Men who played soldier for profit, who answered to no flag, only money. If they had reached into Fort Bragg, the rot was deeper than I could have imagined. I closed my eyes briefly, then asked, what do we do? Walker didn't hesitate. We gather proof, real proof, enough to make it undeniable. And we do it quietly. I almost laughed, a sound too bitter to be humorous. Proof is what buried me last time. His eyes softened, the weight in them pulling me back to 1,000 nights in combat zones where we had trusted each other's silence more than any oath. This time is different. You're not alone. That was the moment the air between us shifted. For years, I had carried the memory of his steady voice. The way his hand had once pulled me back from the edge of a collapsing wall in Mosul. Now that same steadiness was here, offering me something I had almost forgotten: belief. The bond between us was unspoken, yet undeniable, and in his presence I felt a piece of myself begin to breathe again. But even bonds forged in trust are not invisible. Turner's eyes followed me more closely with every passing day. He began assigning me tasks with no purpose, pulling me into offices under the guise of debriefs, watching for cracks in my expression. His questions were framed as small talk, but every syllable carried suspicion. One evening he leaned across his desk, his voice a mockery of kindness. "You've been through a lot, Morales. I respect that, but you should know loyalty matters here. Careers are built on it, lives too." I met his gaze, forcing calm into my voice. "I've always been loyal, sir." His smile was sharp. "I hope so." When I left his office, my hands were trembling, not with fear but with fury. He knew, maybe not the details, but enough to sense the storm building beneath his feet. That night, Walker found me near the motor pool. The air was heavy with the smell of oil and dust. I told him everything I had seen in Turner's eyes, the suspicion that grew sharper with each passing hour. Walker listened, his expression set in grim lines. "He's tightening the leash. That means he's scared. And fear makes men like him dangerous." I drew a shaky breath. "If we push too hard without proof, he'll bury me again. Maybe worse." Walker stepped closer, his voice low and fierce. "Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance." For a moment, the world narrowed to the space between us. The depot, the suspicions, the forged papers, all of it faded. What remained was the quiet strength in his eyes, the certainty that no matter how dark the road grew, I would not walk it alone. It would have been easier to tell him to leave, to push him away before Turner's neck closed tighter. But instead, I let the silence stretch, unspoken words thick in the air. Bonds built in war do not fade with time. They lie dormant until fire calls them back to life. Still, danger pressed close. Within days, Turner reassigned me to night inventory, a task that kept me isolated in the far warehouses while others slept. On the surface, it looked like punishment. In truth, it gave him cover, fewer eyes to see what I might uncover. But solitude was not silence in those long hours. With only the hum of fluorescent lights and the scratch of pen on paper, I pieced together the threads. One shipment stood out, a convoy listed as routed through Bragg, but the logs showed it never arrived. The seals on the paperwork bore faint irregularities, as though someone had pressed the wrong stamp, then corrected it. Sloppy work hidden beneath layers of formality. My stomach turned cold. The missing shipment wasn't small. Dozens of crates, rifles, explosives. Disappeared into thin air. Turner's name was not on that form, but his fingerprints were all over it, and whoever had signed off had known exactly what they were doing. I sat back, the silence pressing against me. Proof. This was what Walker wanted, what I feared, a truth too sharp to ignore. But truth is a blade that cuts both ways. I closed my eyes, the weight of it pressing down. If I stepped forward now, there would be no going back, no hiding behind silence, no fading into obscurity. The world would see me again, for better or worse. And this time, Turner would not stop at stripping rank. As I folded the papers and tucked them deep into my jacket, I heard Walker's voice echo in my memory. "You're not alone." For the first time in years, I believed it. If you've ever found yourself standing at the edge of a choice that could cost everything, you know the way the air feels heavy, charged, as though the world is holding its breath. That was where I stood, and the next step I took would decide not only my fate, but the lives of every soldier caught in Turner's shadow. The missing shipment would not leave me alone. I carried the serial numbers in my head like a litany and traced their crooked path through the system. The trail bent around corners where it should have run straight. Forms echoed one another with new dates in the same handwriting. A seal looked a fraction too soft, as if pressed through a layer of paper towel. Small things, but in war the small things are where lives go to hide. Turner kept me on night inventory, which meant I moved alone through the long ribs of the warehouse under lights that hummed like tired bees. Pallets rose in shadowed stacks. Plastic wrap crinkled when the air units kicked on. I checked locks by touch and logged each bay with a pencil that had been sharpened down to a stub. Somewhere a radio played a love song that made the concrete feel older. I breathed through it and kept working. On the third night, I waited at the loading dock until the civilian truckers finished their smoke break. They talked in that slow way drivers do after long miles, comparing routes and weather in quiet towns where pie still tastes like memory. I asked a simple question about a waybill that should have crossed this dock at 0200 2 weeks back. One of them frowned and said he had seen a convoy that night near the service road behind the training field, no lights. Wrong direction, his partner warned him with a look, as if words had weight, then changed the subject to football. I thanked them for the pie recommendation I was never going to use and walked away with my pulse louder than my boots. The service road ran past a chain-link fence and into scrub that smelled like pine and diesel. I stood there after shift with coffee stinging my tongue and watched for the kind of tire marks you only notice if you have spent years in dust. There they were, faint and deliberate, turning where no delivery should turn. I followed them to a secondary gate that was supposed to stay locked except during emergency reroutes. The lock hung straight. The hinge bolts were clean, too clean, like someone had wiped them and forgot the dust around them would tell the truth. I filed an innocuous maintenance note about hinge stiffness. Then I went to the chapel and lit a candle the way my grandmother taught me. Palms cupped as if guarding a small bird. Faith on base is practical. You keep the flame alive. You do not ask it to do your work for you. Walker found me near dusk by the motor pool where the air smelled like rubber and rain. He stood with his hands in his pockets and watched a mechanic tighten a belt. He did not ask how I was. He asked what I had found. I told him about the drivers, the wrong turn, the clean bolts. He listened the way good leaders listen, with his eyes and his breath as much as his ears. Then he said what I had not wanted to say first. Someone owns that gate. Someone has keys. Someone up the line. His voice carried quiet certainty when he added that he had reached out to a contact who watched the gray space where duty contracts brush against private money. The name he gave me tasted like rust. A private military firm with a glossy website and a board full of former officers. They promised security solutions and delivered whatever a check could buy. He said their name had appeared near too many investigations that ended without findings. He said they were good at making records look honest. I pressed my palm against the cool metal of the fence and felt my heartbeat come back to my hand. The last time I had pushed into a tangle like this, I had watched my rank slide off my collar. I told him that. He looked at me for a long moment, steady as a level line. He said the men we lost in Mosul would not want my silence if it kept this machine oiled. He said we could move differently this time. Turner's shadow reached us even when he was not there. He had a way of showing up just after a conversation ended, like he could hear heat. He waved a memo and told me the next week would bring a surprise inspection from brass. He smiled in that way that means his surprise would be me on the wrong end of a question. He wanted to control my day, my route, my clock. Control is a fragile god. Men like him feed it hourly. That night I walked my loop and let memory lay out its old map. In Kandahar, shipments had been skimmed through a back gate that looked clean enough to be a photograph. The man behind it had worn a pleasant face and shook hands too much. He had talked about morale and family and then sold away both. When we exposed him, my world burned down and he retired with a pension. That was the lesson written on the inside of my ribs. Truth and power are not siblings. I took a slow breath and wrote a list that would not go to Turner. I wrote serial numbers, dates, truck ID, names of civilian drivers whose stories had tiny mismatches that rang like cracked bells. I memorized the list as I cheated a copy on a laundry tag I could burn with a match if I had to. Then I found Walker in the quiet behind the motor pool and handed him what I knew without handing him anything at all. We spoke in half sentences. He filled the rest with the kind of trust that is not a word but a muscle that holds under weight. He said his contact had confirmed the whispers. The private firm maintained a shell office 90 minutes from Bragg where meetings happened after business hours and no one signed in with their real names. He suggested it would help to know who went through that door. He did not tell me to stand down. He did not give me permission. He said he believed I knew the risk and would choose a way through it that honored the ones who had taught us how to move in the dark. Everything inside me tilted. Part of me wanted to stay in my narrow lane, to guard the depot and keep young soldiers safe one pallet at a time. Another part lifted its head at the scent of the hunt. That part remembered how to tally breath and shadow and time. It remembered how to come home. If you have ever stood at a fork with no signs and felt your whole life ask for courage, you know the way your mouth goes dry and your hands go steady. I tailed Turner on a Tuesday because Tuesdays make people careless. He left the office at 1830 in a civilian jacket and took the long way off base. I followed 3 cars back, letting a delivery van sit like a buffer. He headed north, then west, then into a business park where windows glowed warm with late meetings and parking lots smelled like rain and old coffee. He pulled into a spot without a nameplate and walked toward a door that had a discreet black lens above it. He did not look around. He had looked around for so long he believed he could stop. I angled my car 3 rows over and pretended to check a map on my phone while my eyes watched the door in the glass reflection. Turner showed his ID wallet to an invisible sensor and the door clicked. 2 minutes later, another man arrived, mid-50s, with an expensive haircut. A body that had once been military and now was maintained like a suit. The door took him too. My stomach turned with the certainty that we were no longer dealing with sloppy theft. We were looking at a pipe with valves and contracts and non-disclosure agreements. I sat there until my back ached and my coffee went cold. In 2010, a delivery service worker rolled a hand truck to the same door. The boxes were labeled office supplies. I knew the weight of printer paper by the way wheels complain. These boxes did not ride like paper, too dense, too balanced. He wore a company shirt and a blank expression and signed his own clipboard. I took a photo with my mind and a sketch with my memory. Back on base, I washed my face in the barracks sink and watched water spiral away. I felt both older and truer than I had in years. I wanted to tell someone, and that someone was Walker, not because he was Delta, not because he could make a call, but because he was the one who had looked me in the eye and said he still saw me. I texted one word, Chapel. He replied 5 minutes later with a single letter that said he understood. We met in the side aisle where the light fell soft. I spoke in low sentences. He listened with his whole posture. When I finished, he rested his fingers on the back of a pew like a man feeling wood for weak spots. He said his contact had tied that address to a subsidiary of the private firm we had named. He said 3 other bases had reported minor irregularities that never went anywhere. He said the pattern smelled national. He told me this may be the moment to step forward or step away. He said he would walk either road beside me. The space between us held every mile we had marched apart. I wanted to close it. I wanted to keep it. Want can feel like a mission if you let it. I went back to my room and put on my boots because a choice had been made without ceremony. If you are with me, keep listening. The next steps drew blood. The surprise inspection Turner promised came on Friday. A captain from division arrived with 2 staffers and clipboards and smiles that did not reach their eyes. They walked the bays and asked about locks and procedures. Turner performed, hands slicing the air as he explained barcodes and redundancies. He name-dropped policies. He praised his own rigor in tones that suggested no one else had ever heard of accountability. I answered what they asked me and nothing more. They wanted to see a stage. I kept the curtains ironed and the floor swept. At the end, the captain thanked Turner for his excellence and nodded at me without seeing me at all. Turner winked at the world and shook hands. As they left, the captain glanced back at a stack labeled training munitions and asked if the seals were new. Turner answered with a number and a date that were both true and misleading. My heart made a small hard knot when a lie hides inside a truth. It is harder to pull free. That night, with the inspection over and the base relaxed into its weekend posture, I took a walk past the motor pool where the smell of hot metal fades into dirt and grass. Walker fell in beside me without a word. I told him about the performance, the nods, the question about the seals. He said the firm we suspected had just won a bid to provide advisory services on logistics modernization. He said the language was vague in all the places that should be specific. He said a friend in Intel believed the bid had been shaped upstream. Money flows downhill, so does pressure. I looked at the stars above the tree line and felt my jaw lock. I told him about the delivery worker with boxes that rode wrong. He took that in and asked me to describe the man twice, then once more with my eyes closed. He said my memory still had edges. He looked pleased and sad at the same time. The next move had to be careful. We could not pull files through channels Turner watched. We needed an eye inside that office park, a way to turn the right lock without leaving prints. Walker said he could place someone, but it would take a week and a favor, and it might spook the nest. He asked if I was willing to keep working the gate from this side while he pressed from the other. He added that he would never ask me to cross a line that would put me in handcuffs if something went wrong. He said it as a promise and as a boundary. That is how trust keeps from becoming recklessness. I told him about a back door in our own system that would not break policy but would let me view aggregate scan data without drilling into restricted files. It was a reporting view used for quarterly metrics. Patterns show themselves to anyone who knows how to read them. I could not pull a single sensitive document. I could compare flows and flag anomalies. We agreed that maps sometimes tell the story better than words. For 3 nights, I built the map. I let lines connect shipments by time and route until the picture formed. There were gaps you could drive a truck through. There were overlaps where 2 shipments wore the same hour like the same shirt. There were loops that came back to brag on paper but never touched asphalt. Each blue line felt like a vein. Each red circle looked like a bruise. I carried the map in my head and met Walker by the fence before dawn. He studied my description until he could have drawn it himself. Then he told me his contact had skimmed the visitor logs at the office park. The list was short, which made the omissions louder. Turner never signed in under his own name. A private conference room was booked twice under a shell LLC that had no employees. A retired officer with connections to the contractor had used a side entrance 3 times in a month. The gate had sensors but no alarms. Someone trusted the people who paid the bills. He asked me a final time if I wanted out. I answered before he finished asking. I said the names of the soldiers we had buried still lived in my throat and I could not swallow them. I said the private with the photo of his baby would one day drive a convoy because Turner liked to schedule promotions right before risky routes and that baby deserved a father who came home. Walker did not touch me. He did not say good job. He stood a little closer as if to mark a line between me and the night. The first break came from a place no one expected. The young driver who had told me about the wrong turn asked if I could sign off on a minor damage report for a pallet that had shifted. He looked nervous and kept glancing over his shoulder. I asked him to breathe and tell me the whole thing. He admitted that 2 weeks earlier, a civilian supervisor he did not recognize had redirected his truck mid-route with an unsigned memo. The man had used my name in the instructions. The driver knew me well enough to question it, but he had followed orders because his foreman told him to keep the line moving. He had not seen where the crate went after he left it in a holding bay near the service road. He only knew it had disappeared before he returned from the restroom. His eyes shone with the fear of someone who thinks he has stumbled into trouble bigger than his paycheck. I thanked him for his honesty and told him that if anyone asked, he had spoken to no one. He nodded like a man receiving absolution and left with his shoulders lighter. I walked outside and let the air hit my face. They had used my name. That was not sloppiness. That was intention. That was a threat laid like a card to see how I would play. For a beat, I wanted to throw something through a window. Then the old training folded around me like armor. Anger is a spark. Purpose is a flame. I sent Walker 3 words. They used me. He replied minutes later with a plan in simple pieces. He would run the memo through a contact who specialized in the way printers betray their owners. He would pull parking lot footage using a badge 2 layers removed from Delta. He would push a quiet inquiry through a civilian channel that does not use rank. He told me to hold steady and to write nothing down. He did not add trust me. He did not need to. Turner called me into his office that afternoon. He complimented my punctuality the way a man compliments a dog that sits. He asked if I had seen anything unusual in the last week. His eyes pinned mine like insects under glass. I said our volumes had risen in a pattern consistent with seasonal training. He waited, wanting me to say more. I gave him a pleasant stillness. He moved on to a lecture about the importance of harmony between military and civilian partners. He used the word synergy twice. He told me that soldiers who stand in the way of progress often find themselves standing alone. He smiled as if he had said something kind. I left with my spine straight. That evening, I wrote a short message in my head for anyone who might be listening on the other side of the screen. If you are with me, press the button that keeps this story close. Do it for the ones who move through the night so others can sleep. I slept in fragments again. But in those thin hours, something new arrived, a sense not of dread but direction. I had the gate, the map, the face of the delivery man, the driver's confession, the office park with its clean hinges. Walker had the logs, the printer trail, the contact who could make private doors open just enough to see the light inside. We were not guessing anymore. We were building a case. We were building it together. The next morning, the chapel smelled like lemon oil and candle smoke. I sat in the back and let my heartbeat find the slow rhythm of the room. I thought of the first time Walker and I had walked into fire on the same day, how he had looked at me afterward and said that courage is not the absence of fear, it is the choice to carry fear with you and still move. I stood and touched the wooden rail and made a choice I had been making in pieces for weeks. I would move. Outside, the sky was the color of a clean sheet. A breeze lifted the pine tips and set them whispering. I squared my shoulders and headed for the depot. Somewhere behind glass and passwords and signatures, men counted profits while they turned soldiers into risk lines. Somewhere closer, a major with polished boots believed he could bury me again. They had used my name to move a crate. I would use my name to move a mountain. If you want to see how the first stone shifts, stay with me to the next chapter. The moments ahead will break the surface, and what rises will not be gentle. The news came like a knife slipped between the ribs. A convoy of young soldiers, barely out of training, had been sent on what should have been a routine supply run. Somewhere along the line, their position was compromised. A roadside ambush, crude but effective, shredded the lead vehicle before anyone knew they were spotted. 2 men wounded, one barely clinging to life. Word spread through the base faster than official reports ever could. Everyone whispered the same question. How had the enemy known? I stood in the motor pool with the stench of burned oil and hot tires in my nose, staring at the bandages on a boy who looked like he still belonged on a football field. His hand shook as he tried to light a cigarette, and for a moment I saw the hollow eyes of a private from Mosul who had once asked me if the fear ever goes away. That private never made it home. Watching this boy tremble, I knew we were repeating the same history. It had my fingerprints all over it. The intelligence leak we had been circling had just spilled blood. Guilt hit me hard enough to stagger. I had mapped patterns and traced shipments and whispered suspicions into the dark, but I had not acted soon enough. Those young men had paid the price. I pressed my palms flat on the hood of a Humvee until the heat steadied me. My name had been used once already in forged orders. If I stayed quiet, I would be complicit. If I stayed hidden, others would bleed. That was the moment I said it aloud, even if only in my head. I am Captain Alina Morales. I always was, and tonight I take her back. I went to Walker because there was no one else I could trust with the weight of that choice. He met me in the chapel again, the same pew that had become our war room. His face was carved with the kind of fatigue only officers who bury soldiers know, but his eyes sharpened the second I told him what I was ready to do. I would go under. I would take the mask of a bitter, demoted soldier and wear it like my own skin. The private firm that had been siphoning weapons and intelligence wanted disillusioned veterans. They wanted men and women who knew the system well enough to exploit it but had no loyalty left to protect it. I fit their mold too perfectly for it to be coincidence. Walker did not waste time with lectures or questions. He only asked if I understood the cost, if they caught me. No rescue could be guaranteed. If Turner caught even a whiff of what we were attempting, he would burn me down before I reached the door. I told him I had already buried more than one life, and I would not let another convoy of children drive blind into an ambush because I was afraid of falling again. His jaw tightened. He nodded once, that was all. The first step was building the mask. A disillusioned sergeant has a rhythm, a vocabulary, a way of moving through the world. I began letting little cracks show in front of the right people. I muttered under my breath about unfair assignments where Turner had humiliated me. I made sure the discontent bled just enough into my posture when the recruiter's scout was nearby. They always had scouts, men in civilian clothes who hung around the bars outside the gate, listening for complaints. Women who worked at supply companies but knew the tone of a soldier on the edge. I planted seeds without making them too obvious. complaints that sounded earned, frustration that sounded tired instead of reckless. A recruiter is like a fisherman. You have to let them believe you're biting the bait on your own. Turner made it easy. He had a gift for cruelty that bred resentment in anyone he commanded. He rode me harder than usual after the ambush, barking about accountability in front of the whole unit. He called me dead weight. He reminded me loudly that a demoted captain should be grateful to still wear a uniform. Each insult became a brushstroke on the picture I wanted painted of myself. Bitter, broken, ripe for an exit, I let the mask grow until even I almost believed it. The contact came quicker than I expected. A man in a faded ball cap bought me a drink at the bar outside Bragg. He had the kind of easy voice that slides into your ear like it belongs there. He asked if I ever thought about getting out, about how some people deserved better than to rot under officers who had no clue. I said nothing for a long time, then let him drag the words out of me piece by piece, that I had once been more, that I had been crushed for telling the truth, that now I was counting the days until I could leave. His eyes lit up. He told me he knew people who valued loyalty above bureaucracy, people who paid what you were worth. When he slid a card across the bar, I picked it up slow, as if my hand might shake. The card had nothing but a number and a single letter pressed into the paper. No name, no title, no logo. I tucked it into my sleeve without looking. He grinned, lifted his beer, and left without finishing it. Walker and I met that night in the shadow of the fence. I showed him the card. His jaw clenched again, but he said this was the opening we had been waiting for. He gave me a phrase to use if I needed an emergency extraction, a phrase so ordinary it would pass for small talk unless you knew the code. He told me I was not alone, even if it felt like it. For a moment the mask slipped and I almost reached for his hand. Instead, I nodded and walked back into the barracks like I was carrying nothing but fatigue. The call came 2 nights later. A calm voice asked me to meet at a diner on the edge of town, the kind with vinyl booths and coffee that tastes like metal. I wore civilian clothes, simple jeans, and a sweatshirt, hair pulled back like I had stopped caring. The recruiter sat across from me with files he never opened. He spoke about opportunity, about freedom from command structures that only punished the brave. He told me he had read my record, the official one that ended with disgrace. He said men like Turner always landed on their feet while truth-tellers like me were left behind. I let bitterness spill across my face. He smiled like he had won a hand of cards. When he slid the contract toward me, I did not touch it. I asked questions instead. The kind of questions someone desperate to be believed would ask. How do I know I can trust you? What happens if I sign? Where would they send me? He answered carefully, too carefully, which told me he had rehearsed these lines 100 times before. But there were holes, little ones, in the way he described logistics. Holes I recognized from the shipment anomalies I had mapped. He was not a recruiter. He was a handler. He was feeding me just enough truth to anchor the lie. As I walked out of that diner, I caught my reflection in the window. The woman staring back was not a nameless sergeant anymore. She was the captain who had once fought through a firefight in Kandahar with smoke choking her lungs. She was the officer who had dragged a wounded man to safety in Mosul while mortars split the air. She was the soldier who had lost everything for daring to tell the truth. And she was still here, still standing. I whispered it under my breath as I crossed the parking lot. I am Captain Morales, and tonight the mask is mine, not theirs. The danger was only beginning. Turner's suspicion followed me like a shadow I could not shake. He watched me closer, asked questions that sounded casual but carried barbs. He knew I was moving in places he could not see, but he had no proof, not yet. I carried myself with the weight of someone unraveling, and that seemed to satisfy him. Still, I caught him watching me the way predators watch a wounded animal. Walker stayed silent in public, but found ways to remind me he was there. A glance held a beat longer than it needed to. A question that sounded routine but carried quiet reassurance. Those fragments became lifelines. In the middle of deception, his trust was the one truth I could hold on to. The mission had begun, and there was no turning back. Each step forward meant peeling away another layer of myself, and each layer took me closer to the heart of the conspiracy that had already cost too many lives. And if you want to see what happens when the mask and the truth collide, follow me into the next part. The real test was only just beginning. The first mission they offered me was small, at least on the surface. I was told to sit in on a logistics handoff, a transfer of crates from a contractor truck to a civilian vehicle. The orders were simple: observe, stay quiet, and carry one box to prove I could be trusted. It felt almost laughable, but in the world of shadows, the smallest tasks were tests, and every step deeper was another thread binding me to their network. I played my role well. I complained about the army, grumbled about wasted years, let bitterness stain my words. The recruiter nodded, satisfied. When he placed the box in my hands, I made sure it trembled just enough to look like nerves. Inside the crate, I knew there were weapons, the kind stamped with federal markings that should have never left government control. I carried it anyway. One act, one performance. One line in the script that would drag me further into the underworld Turner had already sold his soul to. After that night, the tone changed. They trusted me more, at least enough to let me hear things I wasn't supposed to hear. Whispers about destinations that didn't appear on any official map. Codes passed in casual conversation, numbers that matched the missing shipments I had memorized. I realized quickly this was no side hustle. It was a pipeline stretching beyond Fort Bragg, feeding enemies who would use these weapons against our own. Turner became more dangerous as my cover deepened. His suspicion sharpened into something closer to obsession. He would linger in doorways when I passed, his voice too smooth when he asked about my evenings off base. Once he cornered me outside the depot and said in a low tone that loyalty was the only thing that mattered in uniform. I told him I understood. He leaned close enough for me to smell the coffee on his breath and whispered that he hoped I meant it. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had already planned how to dispose of me. I told Walker everything, though never in words I couldn't take back. Sometimes it was a folded scrap of paper left in a chapel hymnal. Sometimes it was the way I brushed past him in a corridor, slipping a detail into his hand with the stealth of a thief. He never showed surprise, never let his expression give us away. But in the shadows, his voice was steady. Keep going, Morales, you're getting closer. There was one night I'll never forget. A storm rolled over Bragg, the kind that rattles windows and turns the sky into a battlefield of thunder. I was told to meet the handler again, this time in a warehouse on the edge of town. Rain lashed my windshield as I drove, and for a moment I wondered if anyone would notice if I never came back. Inside the warehouse, the handler paced like a man who owned the world. He spoke of expansion, of how valuable soldiers like me could be. He promised freedom, money, even a kind of twisted honor. I smiled just enough to keep him talking. But then he said something that made the air freeze in my lungs. Turner's name. He called him a partner. A man who knew how to grease the system, who ensured that nothing got traced back to their firm. Hearing it spoken aloud was both vindication and terror. Proof, yes, but proof that the man who held authority over me was tethered by blood money to a network I had just walked into. When I left the warehouse, the rain had slowed, but my heartbeat had not. I drove straight to the base, straight to Walker. He was waiting near the chapel as if he had known I would come. I told him what I had heard, my voice shaking more than I wanted it to. He listened without interrupting, his expression hardening with every word. When I finished, I expected him to tell me to pull out, to end it before it was too late. Instead, he looked at me with a kind of fierce steadiness that rooted me in place. This is it, Morales. This is the thread we can pull, but it means going deeper. I shook my head. Deeper could mean I never came back. He stepped closer, the storm still dripping from his jacket, and his voice was low but unflinching. If you step forward, I'll be there, just like before. The weight of that promise was heavier than any weapon I had carried. For years, I had been alone in my fight, alone in my disgrace, alone in my silence. But in that moment, standing in the rain-soaked dark, I felt the bond between us solidify into something undeniable. Not just trust, not just respect, something more. The days blurred into weeks after that. I played the role of the bitter sergeant flawlessly, and the network pulled me closer. They began giving me details of larger shipments, hinted at bigger operations. At night, I would commit every number to memory, then share it with Walker under the cover of routine conversations. A glance, a word, a brush of paper. It became our secret language, one only the two of us could understand. Turner, meanwhile, circled me like a hawk. He reassigned me twice in 1 week, moving me from warehouse duty to motor pool and back again. It made no sense except as a way to keep me off balance. Once I caught him staring at me across the yard, his eyes narrowed in a way that left no doubt. He knew something was wrong. He just couldn't prove it yet. That tension became its own battlefield. On one side, the PMC drew me in with promises of belonging and reward. On the other, Turner tightened his net. Convinced I was hiding something, and caught in the middle, Walker and I built a fragile thread of resistance, weaving proof out of whispers and stolen glances. One night, after another meeting with the handler, I sat alone in my quarters staring at my reflection in the darkened window. The woman looking back was both familiar and foreign. She was the disgraced sergeant the world saw, but she was also the captain who had led men through hell and dragged them back alive. The mask and the truth were bleeding into each other, and I wasn't sure where one ended and the other began. But I knew this. I could not turn back. Too many lives had already been shattered by the secrets I carried. Too many soldiers trusted the system, unaware it was being hollowed out from within. When I closed my eyes, I heard Walker's voice again. "If you step forward, I'll be there." That was enough to steady me, enough to remind me that I was not alone. Even in the darkest corners of this shadow war, the real fight was only beginning, and I would face it as Captain Morales, not as the ghost Turner wanted me to be. And as I prepare to take that next step, remember this. The closer you walk to the fire, the harder it is to tell whether it will burn you or forge you into something stronger. The night everything unraveled was colder than it should have been. Even in North Carolina, late spring usually carries warmth in the air, but that night the wind cut sharp. It carried the smell of rain and exhaust, the kind of scent you never forget once you've stood on a staging ground before a mission. Only this time, the battlefield was not across the ocean. It was inside the fences of our own base. Walker had moved quietly, gathering a team from Delta who could be trusted. No leaks, no questions. Men who had bled alongside us before, men who knew how to keep their eyes steady when the truth grew ugly. He told them only what they needed. A PMC was preparing to move a major shipment off Bragg, and Turner was the inside man. The goal was to intercept the convoy, capture evidence, and cut off the flow before it reached enemy hands. Simple on paper, deadly in execution. I stood at the edge of the hangar as the team prepped. Weapons checked, radios tested, gloves pulled tight. For the first time since Kandahar, I felt the hum of combat settle into my bones. It was the sound of belonging, of stepping into who I truly was. Walker caught my gaze, and the nod he gave me carried more than orders. It carried trust. The convoy rolled out just after midnight, 3 trucks with false manifests. Turner was there, arrogant as ever, certain of his untouchable power. I watched from the shadows as the trap snapped shut. Delta surged forward with the precision of men born for chaos. Engines cut, shouts filled the night, and for once the enemy was caught off guard. The crates spilled open under flashlight beams, revealing weapons stamped with government seals. Proof, undeniable, irrefutable proof. Turner's face drained of color when Walker stepped from the dark. For years he had hidden behind ranks and papers, but none of that mattered now. He lunged for a sidearm, but I was faster. My hand clamped his wrist, twisting until the pistol clattered onto the asphalt. He looked into my eyes, recognition dawning at last. Captain Morales. The words slipped from his mouth like a curse. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "Captain Morales." The cuffs closed around his wrists, the sound sharp as justice. The contractor handlers were hauled from their trucks, shouting promises of lawyers and retaliation. None of it mattered. Their pipeline was severed, their shield of secrecy torn apart. When it was over, the base hummed with whispers. Some called me reckless, others brave. The official report would take weeks to write, but the truth had already spread. The forgotten sergeant, the nameless guard, had torn open a conspiracy from the inside. My record was restored, the rank of captain pinned back onto my file with the neatness of paperwork. But the scars I carried could never be erased by ink. The general who reinstated me offered public recognition, a ceremony, even a commendation. I declined. Medals gather dust, speeches fade. What mattered were the boys in the motor pool who now had a chance to grow old. What mattered were the convoys that would move tomorrow without ambush waiting in the dark. My honor was never about brass on my collar. It was about doing what had to be done, even when the cost was everything. Walker found me days later by the depot fence, the same place where so much had begun. He leaned against the railing, his arms folded, watching me with that half smile that never gave away too much. "You could come back," he said quietly. "Delta would take you in a heartbeat." I shook my head, though the thought tugged at me. Not yet, maybe not ever. Someone has to stand this post. Someone has to watch the quiet places. His eyes softened. "If the day comes, you know where to find us." I smiled then, the kind of smile that comes after storms when the sky finally clears. I told him I would keep the gate safe for now, and he nodded, accepting it without argument. That was the thing about men like Walker. They never demanded more than you could give. The last time I saw him before he shipped out again, he paused at the gate. His voice carried just enough for me to hear. "You're not forgotten, Morales, not anymore." And then he was gone, swallowed by duty. So I stayed, boots on concrete, rifle at my side. The neon light buzzing above me just as it had the night this story began. Only this time, the weight on my shoulders was different. I was no longer the invisible sergeant they thought they could bury. I was Alina Morales, soldier, survivor, and guardian. Some heroes stand in the spotlight, their names etched in history. Others remain in the shadows, unseen, uncelebrated, but both serve the same mission: to protect, to endure, to carry the burden so others can walk free. And that is enough for me. If this story has touched you, if you believe the sacrifices of quiet soldiers deserve to be remembered, share it. Let their voices echo. And if you want to hear more truths like mine, subscribe to Military Revenge. Together, we can keep their stories alive. The night is quiet again, the hum of the depot steady, the world beyond the fence still turning. And I am here watching, waiting, standing guard. Not a nameless soldier anymore, but one who carries the memory of all who cannot stand beside me. My name is Captain Alina Morales, and this is the truth.